Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Frozen Chosin, the 1st Marine Division and the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, by Thomas McKelvey Cleaver, narrated by Norman Dietz. The country around the Chosin Reservoir in winter was never intended for military operations. Even Genghis Khan wouldn't tackle it. Major General Oliver P. Smith, Commanding General, 1st Marine Division, 1950. Prologue. United States Marines are special people. As an Army soldier, I only suspected this for 27 years, and with occasionally a tinge of jealousy, I must admit. Then, in 1993, a man I had come to know fairly well while I worked for General Colin Powell, General Chuck Krulak, then Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, asked me to go to Marine Corps Base, Quantico, Virginia, and take over as Deputy Director of the Marine Corps War College. I did. What happened there, in one sense, immediately taught me a great deal. The immediate lesson came from my new boss, the college's director, Marine Colonel W.R. Rick Donnelly. Rick called me into his office as soon as I arrived, shut the door, told me to sit down, and then told me he was dying. From that moment on, I began to realize I had probably never met a braver man. It's one thing to breast enemy fire, to go once more into the breach, to overcome one's fear in a rush of adrenaline or in a deep and frenetic desire to help one's buddies. It's quite another to succumb to an ugly death in the middle of life, no combat, no sounds of the guns, just the creeping, inexorable death that comes from a virulent and incurable cancer. At the end, as Rick had wasted almost completely away before our incredulous eyes, he refused even to let his 16-year-old son see him. He wanted his son, he said, to remember him as the strong, healthy, vibrant Marine he had been. I understood completely. A week or so after Rick's funeral, I made a special trip, alone, to Arlington Cemetery to kneel before his freshly turned grave and thank him for the brief period he had let me know him. To this day, I still have his office nameplate, its brilliant red backdrop trimmed in bright yellow, secured in my home. He was a man I shall never forget. The longer-term lesson was that I came to realize over time that part of this man's demeanor and its underlying character were a product of the U.S. Marine Corps, its ethos, its history, and its incredible cohesiveness. The other services in general have concluded that the Marines have the best uniforms. What most won't admit, though, is they have the best warriors. In this book, Thomas McKelvey Cleaver tells a typical story about these warriors. This one in 1950, in the heady days of the massive incursion of China into North Korea, at a place identified in the history books as the Chosin Reservoir. It is by no means typical in the sense that men throughout history have done similar deeds. They most certainly have not. Perhaps on a dozen or so occasions in the past 5,000 years have men performed in the manner of these Marines in North Korea. This story is typical of the United States Marine Corps because of those dozen or so stories, at least a quarter belong to them. It is not a story of strategic and tactical genius such as that of Alexander, or of the harnessing of new concepts or brilliant maneuvers, as did the best of the German commanders in World War II, or of subtlety, creativity, and critical thinking, such as I think we military professionals imagine in Sun Tzu's armies. Neither is it the fundamental determination of Wellington's men at Waterloo, or of Mao Zedong's fighters on the Long March, nor Marlborough's brilliant ubiquity at Blenheim, or Slim's artful craftiness in Burma. It's in many ways indefinable, but the listener will recognize it instantly. Like the old saw says about pornography, we cannot define it, but we know it when we see it. In this book, the listener can imagine a Marine fighting in sock-clad feet in temperatures of 20 below zero, with Siberian wind chills pushing the cold far below even that, against seemingly insurmountable odds all night long. Later, having miraculously survived the battle, he will lose all his toes to frostbite. The listener can imagine a unit of 200 men dwindle to 150, then to 100, then to 85, then still lower, and yet maintain unit cohesion, unit integrity, sufficient to repulse a determined and outnumbering enemy again and again and again, all in weather so appallingly cold that even the imagination is incapable of conjuring it. Such actions give full confirmation to the Marine's ironclad concept of every man a rifleman. Cooks, supply men, truck drivers, it does not matter. Every Marine is taught how to fight and how to use his weapons, and how to be the ultimate key to survival if necessary, or to be the last man standing or dead. Like the Spartans, they retire from the fray with their shield or on it. The listener can imagine Marine pilots taking off from icy carrier decks, pitching so violently in 30-knot winds, and an abominable sea state that just getting off successfully is the severest challenge, only once off to penetrate fog and ice-filled cloud cover that restricts vision completely until one penetrates it on the way back down to deliver ordnance without which the Marines on the ground might not make it through another day, or night in some cases. I used to consider Army aviation as being close-knit with its infantry, as I was for over a decade an Army aviator, including in the Vietnam conflict, in addition to being an infantry officer. But Army aviation is not comparable to Marine aviation. Marine pilots live and die for their ground-pounding riflemen. They have no other mission, indeed in combat no other reason to exist. The Marine Corps instills this team ethos deeply. In this book, the listener can hear so many acts of unparalleled courage that from time to time he or she has to unlimber the book, put it aside, and just stare into the near distance, contemplating what it must have been like, knowing full well that there is no way really to know. Courage, tenacity, even audacity are all inadequate terms. In contrasts as sharp as the weather around the reservoir, the listener also comes to grasp just how different these Marines are from those surrounding them, soldiers of the 8th Army and X-Corps, both U.S. and South Korean, and the enemy in the opening stages of the Korean War, mostly North Koreans, but later and predominantly Chinese volunteers. Similarly sharp contrasts exist among U.S. and Allied commanders. From the very top, where an almost godlike figure named Douglas MacArthur reigned in utter disregard of the facts, surrounded by sycophants who kept him well oiled in that regard, to the bottom, where task force, battalion, and company commanders and platoon leaders of all stripes and complexions saved the day. I had had some experience vicariously of one commander of the former category. ex-Corps Commander General Ned Amund had come to my somewhat intimate knowledge through the many interviews of African American soldiers I had conducted during the 4 years in which General Colin Powell had inspired me to investigate how consistently African Americans had answered the nation's call to arms when Powell was the first African American chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and I was his speechwriter. The purpose of these interviews was to help chronicle the many contributions African American servicemen had made to the defense of the nation, while at the same time being treated as second-class citizens or worse. Or worse included, for example, coming home from World War I battlefields and having their uniforms ripped off their bodies by white men and, as they kicked and fought back against the mob, being summarily hanged from trees, their necks breaking and their life ceasing in the Southern-style "I'll teach you, boy" lynching. To a man, these soldiers and Marines whom I interviewed detested Amund, either from direct contact with him or from word-of-mouth criticism of him that passed through their ranks. Amund had commanded the almost exclusively African-American 92nd Infantry Division in Italy during World War II. From Luray, Virginia, a graduate of VMI and, like most such men at the time, a racist, Amund claimed his division's poor performance in Italy was due to its being composed of African American troops who, in his view, would never make good soldiers and should not be called upon to serve in this way again. In North Korea, at the head of X-Corps, Amund proved the opposite, that the poor quality of his leadership was the problem. Cleaver gives ample evidence to this effect. For glaring example, as the Marines at the reservoir are being virtually surrounded by tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers, Amund is still demanding that they continue their attack to the Yalu River. He admonishes them not to be afraid of Chinese laundrymen. Amund makes cameo battlefield appearances several times during the ensuing battles, arriving from his heated airplane or car, pontificating for a few moments, and then retreating to his heated airplane or car, and ultimately to his quintessentially safe headquarters. Once he even brings several silver stars with him, and asks that men be quickly selected upon whose tunics he can pin these high awards for heroism. 2 of the men, officers who must listen to their commanding general and obey, are so pinned. When Amund is gone, they pluck off the medals and toss them in the snow in utter disgust. Poor leadership and an uncanny ability to underestimate the enemy's capabilities are not limited to Amund either. Many listeners will already be aware of Douglas MacArthur's grave lack of military leadership in occupied Japan. While concentrating on his role as potentate-in-chief of Japan, he completely neglected his troops. Easy sex, lax work schedules, and almost no training at all characterized post-war service in Japan. Most soldiers could not even shoot well with their basic weapon. When war broke out on the Korean Peninsula in June 1950, the U.S. Army in Japan was as unprepared as any army in U.S. history, and that is saying a great deal. MacArthur's negligence did not stop there. Most listeners will be familiar with the 5-star general's bellicose and even insubordinate language that finally got him relieved by President Truman, but his fundamental failings in understanding his enemies, interpreting his intelligence, and calculating the proper strategy, despite his brilliant counterstroke at Incheon, sort of beggar the imagination. One has to assume, I feel, that senility was beginning to affect the 70-year-old general. certainly an unbridled arrogance and proud nature were. Having reached my own 70 years, I can attest personally to the diminution in powers old age often brings. Truman and Marshall bear some of the blame here, of course, because they tolerated the self-loving and increasingly politically motivated MacArthur far too long. And despite his Hollywood-like reprisal after World War II, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Omar Bradley, was not noted for his great battlefield talents either. Bradley was the Army general sitting in Spa, Belgium, 200 miles from his forward units, playing a game of bridge when the Germans counterattacked in the Ardennes forest in December 1944, perpetrating the worst defeat and more casualties on American forces than in any other single World War II battle, and this after Bradley and others had been warned by front-line intelligence about clear signs of a German attack, but in their comfortable ignorance chose to ignore the intelligence. The mission creep, as we might say today, that in 1950 infected both Washington and Tokyo, however, stands out as the cruelest blow to the Marines and others on the ground in North Korea, who had to endure the numerically astounding Chinese intervention in the war. Washington's calculations were as lopsidedly wrong in late 1950 with regard to China's understandable fears as they are today with regard to Russia's concerns in Georgia and Ukraine. From 1993 to the present day, the U.S. pushed itself and the NATO alliance closer and closer to Russia's boundaries, as if nothing would happen in response. Then, when Moscow did respond in Georgia, in the Crimea, and then in Ukraine proper, U.S. leaders acted as if they were gravely surprised. Perhaps they, and the leaders in 1950, were in fact surprised. That would be a strong indictment of their leadership. They should not have been surprised, not at all. And in 1950 many men paid the ultimate price for this negligence. No, Truman and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, his Secretary of Defense, George Marshall, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff do not fare well in this recounting of the Marines' story, if only by indirection. Unlike the deeply pragmatic President George H.W. Bush, who in 1991 wisely decided not to go to Baghdad, Truman and his advisers are eager to go to the Yalu, and the fledgling United Nations is eager to exceed its own implicit mandate and bless such an enterprise. Thousands of men on both sides of the conflict paid with their lives for this hubris. So did thousands of women and children. The strategic result was, of course, a dividing line between the two Koreas at about the same location as when the rush to the Yalu began. If so many had not paid the blood price, the failure would be risible. In this debacle of American and Allied arms, for that is surely what it was, in fact, following the Chinese intervention, leaders of all the Allied forces were seriously considering abandoning the peninsula altogether. The performance of the U.S. Marines around the Chosin Reservoir stands out like a towering volcano rising from a flat desert. This incredible performance by America's most valiant warriors is far and away the main story of this book. It is well told, as such a story should be. Lawrence B. Wilkerson, Colonel, USA, retired. College of William and Mary, December 2015. Introduction. I well remember the first time I heard the words Chosin Reservoir. It was the summer of 1951. the Sunday after my birthday. The occasion was the visit to our home in Denver, Colorado, of Cousin David, who was someone in the wider family of Cleavers, Thomases, McKelveys, and Weists I had not heard of before. My father told me Cousin David was home from Korea. That was a word I had learned over the previous year, having been confused in the summer of 1950 as to whether we were fighting with North Korea against South Korea, as I had declared mistakenly to my best friend, to his laughter before he straightened me out. Then my father said that Cousin David had been at the Chosin Reservoir. What was that, I wondered? Cousin David, when he arrived in our living room later that afternoon with his parents, turned out to be not much older than the students at South High School who passed in front of our house during the school year, walking down Louisiana Avenue to the school with the tall bell tower 5 blocks west, as my friends and I made our way over to Washington Park Elementary, 2 blocks north of the high school. But there was something about Cousin David, who I would learn in later years was all of 19 at the time, that was different from those teenagers. He seemed somehow older than he looked. At one point in the gathering I found myself alone with him, and I asked, "What's the Chosin Reservoir?" I remember he looked startled for an instant before he laughed and replied, "Kid, you don't want to know." An aunt came over at that moment, and he was gone. But my desire to know what's the Chosin Reservoir has remained with me for all the years since. I was never able to ask Cousin David any more questions, since he was one of the 33,686 Americans who died on the battlefields of Korea. I have taken every opportunity in the years since to ask anyone I met who was there the answer to my question. My interest in the Korean War was enhanced by my good fortune in meeting ex-President Truman during the summer of my 14th birthday. I had traveled from Denver to Independence, Missouri, to visit my granduncle, Jim McKelvey, who had served with Captain Truman in the battery of Missouri National Guard field artillery he had commanded during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, and who had spent the next 30 years as a political operative for Mr. Truman in Missouri and later in Washington. The second morning I was there, we went out for an early morning walk, and soon came across Mr. Truman on his traditional morning constitutional. I was introduced, and President Truman asked us to join him. We ended our walk, and I had to work to keep up with him, at his home, where he invited us in for breakfast. I think I am likely the only member of my generation who can say he once ate a breakfast personally cooked for him by a former President of the United States. For the record, it was fried eggs up, sausage and bacon, and toast with orange marmalade, still my favorite way to start the day. While he performed the duty of chef, Mr. Truman closely questioned me regarding my knowledge of history, and I was impressed by both the breadth and depth of his historical grasp. For the record, I passed the examination. I have always considered Harry Truman to be America's last Republican, small r intended, president, and I freely admit that my account of the events of 1950 takes his side of the argument. I believe any investigator cannot do otherwise when they review the facts. Historian Mark Bloch wrote, "Misunderstanding of the present is the inevitable consequence of ignorance of the past." In studying the experience of the United States in the Korean War, the truth of that statement becomes terribly obvious. One can see that the road to involvement in Korea was the direct result of complete ignorance of the history of Korea combined with a total misunderstanding of the nature of the communist countries, leading to a failure to understand that they would act in defense of their perceived national interests as would any other country. The failure of understanding is a feature of the policy decisions and strategic choices made by the United States throughout the Cold War and in the years since. The failure to learn the lessons of the Korean War led inevitably to the Vietnam War, which was also the result of failing to understand the history of Southeast Asia and thus have an accurate understanding of the real nature of the war we so blithely entered, the war I would serve in. The United States has not won a war since World War II, primarily due to this failure to understand the true nature of the perceived enemy. Indeed, it can still be seen today in the so-called war on terror that has involved the United States in endless conflict throughout the Middle East, in wars that were and are incapable of being won, at least in ways that Americans understand the word win. Americans pride themselves on being people who show their best selves in the worst circumstances. Thus, the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in 1950 has assumed mythological status in the national memory, given it is the one military event of the past 70 years that wholly and completely fulfills this national mythology. It is my hope that the listener will come to the end of this book with an understanding of how the Chosin Reservoir campaign, which really does fit all the requirements for being considered a mythic event, was the direct result of American failure to understand the past in Korea, which led to misunderstanding of the present in 1950, with all the danger such failure and resultant misunderstanding involved. The United States Marine Corps, in its official history of the Chosin campaign, states, "Not a mile was easy. The road was narrow and winding, of dirt and gravel. Ox carts had a hard time passing, let alone tanks, trucks, and artillery. At times it seemed to go straight up, at others straight down, and always around a hairpin curve where a roadblock could be waiting. Breaking out from Udam-ni to Hungnam cost the United States Marines 200 men per mile. It was the Corps' finest hour." Former Marine Private Ernie Gonzalez, who at 17 was the youngest Marine in Fox Company in the Battle of Toktung Pass, was one of the 240 men who held the pass against the assault of 5 Chinese battalions to ensure escape of the 2nd and 5th Marine Regiments from the reservoir. 12 years after the battle he wrote, in an unpublished manuscript that he entrusted to me 25 years ago, "The fire of patriotism dies quickly. It is cold by the time the band stops playing and the flags are furled and the voices of the cheering multitudes are faint in the distance. By the time the rifleman gets to the battlefield, all the fanfare and cheering is forgotten. All that remains is a suspicion that the hysteria of the send-off was manufactured so that the stay-at-homes would buy another bond or give another pint of blood. The men of Fox Company were not kept in the line of fire by patriotism. The men of my company fought and died at Toktung Pass because we were Marines. We did it for each other." It is that element of sacrifice that elevates Chosin to the level of myth. 25 years ago I first thought to tell this story as a motion picture. I began the research to write the screenplay and had the incredible good fortune to discover that the late Ed McMahon of The Tonight Show was a veteran. Ed gave me his support enthusiastically from my first call to his office. most importantly taking me to the reunion convention of the Frozen Chosin, as the survivors call themselves, which was held in 1989 at the Century City Plaza Hotel in Los Angeles. With Ed's enthusiastic introduction, I was able, over the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?